Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. In episode 16, I concluded, after a survey of different ways to define consciousness and the self, that there is no consensus about a definition. As such, I decided to come to this topic descriptively through the lenses of 4 different dimensions rather than by trying to establish a definition of my own. My descriptions do draw from multiple definitions because it seemed to me that each attempt to define consciousness was paying attention to some important aspects, but perhaps excluding others. And the main distinguishing factor in my descriptions of 1, 2, and 3-dimensional consciousness is awareness, whether a subject, quote unquote, simply experiences events and stimuli, 1-dimensional, or is aware of experiencing them, 2-dimensional, or is aware of being aware, 3-dimensional. Now, keep in mind that a subject might be human, animal, plant, rock, etc. I'm using the term subject to refer to any recipient of an action or a stimuli. But there was a 4th dimension as well, what I called multi-dimensional consciousness. In this case, I'm imagining a subject which experiences what happens, is aware of experiencing it, is aware of being aware, and in addition to everything described in those other 3 types of consciousness, is aware of experiencing what others experience, perhaps even aware of what everything experiences. All things, all people, sentient beings, the entire cosmos, perhaps all universes if there are plural. I'm leaving open, in other words, the possibility of dimensions of consciousness and selfhood that are beyond the human level, or at least beyond the individual human level. I've not yet defined this dimension, words for which often include the divine, the subconscious, collective consciousness, cosmic consciousness, etc. And that raises a lot of other questions, of course. If there is a multidimensional consciousness, is that something only one being experiences or possesses? For example, a singular divine being, i.e. God? Is it something other beings have to a greater or lesser degree as well? Can it be cultivated? I need to hold on to those questions for now, but I want to try to bring this into focus through a more experiential, imaginative way of describing what I'm getting at, in the form of some questions. Does water in some way experience the cold that freezes it into glacial ice, and if so, how? Does a rock experience the crush of that glacier, grinding it into soil? How? Does a subatomic particle within that soil that was the rock experience the effects of the environment that the rock is in? How? Does the soil from that rock experience the rain when it soaks in deep? How? Does a worm experience something in and from the soil? And how? Does an ant crawling on top experience the soil as it carries food to its hole? How? Does a leaf from a tree growing in that soil experience a gentle wind? And how? Does a bird in the branches of the tree, which perhaps ate the worm and feels the gentle wind, experience those? And how? Imagine there's a cat watching the bird in the tree. What is that experience like for the cat? Or there's a human who experiences petting and holding the cat in their lap as it looks out the window at the bird in the tree. What is that experience? Suppose for a moment there is a consciousness other than the human, holding the cat, aware of all the experiences and cognitive functions of all the other things and beings listed. In what way is that being aware? Aware in the third person of what the others are experiencing, or aware in the first person, thus experiencing them also subjectively? What is that experience like? Now, I've presented my descriptions of the 4 dimensions of consciousness in 2 different ways. And at about this point in an episode, I've often paused to include a poem or a song as maybe another way to present something I'm talking about. And I'm tempted to do that here, but this time I'm going to hold the creative expressions until near the end, so stay tuned for that. In the rest of this episode, I'll begin from exploring one-dimensional consciousness in which subjects experience stimuli or actions from others or from the environment, but so far as we know, are not aware of that. Well, what types of things or objects or beings or elements of the cosmos would this include? And how might I go about deciding that? There are two different challenges in settling on an approach. The first is that there's no way for me to actually know what someone or something else is aware of, and therefore exclude them from the second dimension of consciousness, if indeed they're aware at all. That's as true of a rock, for example, as it is of someone in a coma. There may be modes of awareness or instruments of awareness other than what we think we know, other than brains, other than neural activity that we can trace, for example. The second challenge is that I can never touch the surface, much less probe the depths of the many fields of human inquiry and experience and thought and study and belief that could offer wisdom for this exploration. And I'm here thinking of philosophy, psychology, religion, linguistics, anthropology, physics, chemistry, biology, botany, zoology, geology, and so on, almost ad infinitum. I can't know from the inside what or who is aware of what, and I can't probe all of the possible fields of inquiry that might help me come to conclusions about what belongs in this one-dimensional consciousness. So what to do? Well, my plan is to just begin, even if I'm somewhat arbitrary in choosing a starting point, and then I will try to follow the questions where they might lead and seek the answers in the various disciplines that those might present themselves. It's an imperfect plan, and it depends a good deal on intuition to surface the questions and decide on the fields of inquiry that I undertake and to determine what I think an answer might be. Which raises a question. Answer to what? I see a question inside the question, not just the simple question of what belongs in the one-dimensional consciousness box or any of the others. And in fact, it's a question that predates the way I lay out the four dimensions of consciousness. And it's this: what does it mean for a thing or a person or a being to experience existing? Two comments on that right away. First, about the word experience. Let's take rocks as a case study. Does a rock experience anything? It depends on what we mean, of course, when we use the term experience. And I'm employing the term here in a very strict, narrow sense. There is a cause and an effect, and the effect happens to the rock. And that effect is what I'm referring to as experience. So the rock, in this sense, does experience the impact of a glacier, rather brutally, I might add. That doesn't mean that I'm assuming the rock has a psychological or sensory experience of being crushed, both of which would probably then cause me to include it in the two-dimensional consciousness model. That leads me to my second comment, which is to repeat the point I've made above. We can't experience what is inside the experience of another subject. That's even true when we think of the experiences of other humans. Although we can imagine and empathize with what another human is experiencing, we don't really know. So how much more is this the case when we consider what we presume to be inanimate objects? I have no idea what a rock's experience is. But isn't this all absurd, even to ask about rocks being aware of their experiences? I assume most listeners will agree with something like this statement. Rocks don't experience anything because they don't have brains, nerves, emotions, ears. They don't have any instrument or faculty that would enable experience. But notice how riddled this statement is with assumptions that determine the conclusion. A statement like what I just quoted is banking on the truth of an assumption that we know all the instruments and faculties that enable experience. But do we actually know? So to try to explore this, for the rest of the episode, I'm going to ask us to think a little more about rocks and plants. Let me start with rocks. I have what I would call an imaginative way of seeing the world, and in that fertile imagination of mine, rocks take on personality. I even have feelings for rock formations. I imagine them having personalities in some way. I think of them as storing up memories and carrying imprints from their centuries of existence. At the same time, parts of my brain tell me that while this is all fine as imagination, it is not scientifically possible. I assume that most of my listeners will share a similar assumption. I recently came across an article from 2023 in The Guardian in which people were invited to respond to a question. Are rocks conscious? I just want to share a few of the responses from the readers. Here's one. I just asked a rock, i.e. if it was conscious, and it showed no sign of either understanding the question or attempting to reply. So no, I don't think rocks are sentient. Here's another response. I just asked my 2-year-old grandson. I didn't get a response, which I think meant that they were sort of challenging the idea that asking a rock didn't make a lot of sense. That's a sort of humorous opening, I admit, but respondents got a lot more serious, of course. Here's another quote. Academic philosophers have of late been exploring an alternative approach called panpsychism. Instead of explaining consciousness in terms of matter, we account for the emergence of matter by postulating very simple forms of consciousness at the base of reality. This doesn't entail that rocks are conscious, but it does mean that consciousness exists beyond the realm of biology. Now, that person has identified a major fault line in philosophical consideration of our question, namely, is consciousness a result of something in the material world, chemically determined brain functions, for example, or vice versa? Moving to more comments. The shorter answer is just change the word conscious to aware. Only objects that are alive and have a metabolism can be aware. Machines can register a sound and remember it, but they're not aware. They simulate consciousness, but don't possess it. Now note how this conclusion presumes that there are only certain ways of being conscious, having a metabolism, for example, and it also presumes a definition of consciousness, what I've called two-dimensional consciousness, which is to have awareness, and it then eliminates every other type of consciousness that might be possible. Here's another quote. As far as anybody knows, neuronal activity is required for experience. When rocks grow neurons, perhaps they'll be conscious. This is, of course, another assumption-based conclusion, though at least it had the humility to begin with the caveat, so far as anybody knows, which for me is a really important statement. I found this next one fascinating, from a geologist. As a geologist, no, rocks are not conscious. They're not aware of their being, nor do they make conscious decisions. Notice the assumptions there, but this geologist also went on to write this. Also, as a geologist who has spent a long time working on granites, there is something special about them. The granites define a certain type of landscape and therefore a character of place. They come with their myths and legends and are said to whistle different ways in different weathers. Generations of artists and writers have been inspired by the granites. So could rocks be conscious? Maybe. The geologist represents for me a person trying to balance ways of knowing, the scientific way and the imaginative, intuitive way. I also think they were very close to describing what I've called entanglement in episodes that were prior to this when I was exploring the nature of the cosmos. So should we try to balance these two ways of knowing? Or maybe there's more ways of knowing, of course. Our decisions about whether imagination belongs in a scientific or philosophical discussion will also be based on the sorts of assumptions we make, in this case about whether certain types of cognition, certain ways of knowing are superior to others. that topic is brimming with questions about what we assume truth to be and what we assume about how to know the truth. All right, more from the article. One could argue that rocks are conscious, that even though they don't have a brain or nerves, they are somehow aware. Notice again, the equivalence of consciousness and awareness there, but they go on. To do this, we can compare rocks to a couple of things. Plants don't have a brain like animals, and yet it has come to light recently that their root system is akin to a brain. Another thing we can compare rocks to are slime molds. Slime molds can solve mazes and learn despite being single-celled without a brain. Now, that comment came from questioning whether we know all the different modes of being conscious, or all the different physical conditions necessary for it to exist. If a root system can function like a brain, what else might function like a brain? Well, back to the rock. If it is ground up by a glacier, or, say, thrown through a window by a young child, it will in some way experience that, but is that sufficient to say it's conscious? In my description of one-dimensional consciousness, the criteria is simply that something experiences something. That is the criteria of consciousness. And my definition of experience is that something happens to something. In this case, a rock gets crushed or thrown. In that way, yes, a rock is conscious. But of course, by that definition of mine, everything in the universe is conscious at least that level. For me, there's actually more interesting questions, and those will emerge when we turn to 2, 3, and multidimensional consciousness. So, might rocks have two-dimensional consciousness? Might they be aware of experiencing the impact with the glass when a child throws them through a window? My education, what I think of as common sense, tells me no. But some theories in physics and philosophy and some religious ways of seeing the world tell me that I can't rule it out without further digging. Well, leaving rocks for the moment, I'm going to turn to plants. Now, plants are an interesting case because while they lack aspects of what some assume are necessary for consciousness, brains, for example, they exhibit behaviors we associate with conscious beings. Plants can sense changes in their environment and respond. They curl their leaves when we touch them or when they trick or other prey. Plants seem to make decisions about how fast to grow and in what direction. Plants seem to learn and adapt. Some plants stop curling their leaves after learning by experience that a drop of water isn't a threat. Plants seem to monitor a variety of changes in order to anticipate what may happen, not just respond to what is happening or has happened. Plants use electrical signals to process information and then communicate to other plants. Plants behave as if they possess something like what I have defined as two-dimensional consciousness. Certainly there are other explanations for all of that, but we're describing the behavior here. Now, that is what I might call the clinical evidence and what the data says to me. But again, I can't get inside of a plant to experience what it experiences or to be aware of what it might be aware of or not. So at this point, I end up agnostic about both rocks and plants, at least in terms of two-dimensional consciousness, which we will be exploring more about later. So, at least for now, I'm agnostic on that. Well, where to next? As I've done in prior episodes to assess the questions I've been looking at relative to rocks and plants and then other aspects of consciousness, I need to decide how I'm going to incorporate things like philosophy and physics and religious heritages into the inquiry. And I can't unfold all of that in this episode, of course, but let me just share some introductory thoughts. Philosophy. Some philosophers believe that rocks and other inanimate objects have some degree of consciousness. Others, of course, argue that they don't. For example, there is a theory known as panpsychism, which I referenced above, and it's garnered a lot of attention, both in support and in critique. Panpsychism is the idea that all things in the universe have some degree of consciousness. Those in support cite particularly quantum theories. Critics argue, though, that the theory is irrational and unscientific and an inappropriate application of quantum theory. That takes me to physics. Some physicists say that photons exhibit behaviors they deem indicative of consciousness, sort of like our description of plants. When photons, for example, are fired at a background, with or without an observer, the photons seem to be able to tell whether they're being observed and respond differently. Religious ways of seeing. Now, in addition to my prior practice of drawing in insights from several of the so-called world religions, in these episodes I am going to expand that to make mention of a heritage I've not included previously. And that's the ancient and almost universal way of seeing the world as animated by spirits, and thus commonly referred to as animism. There are many different expressions of animism, but they share in common the belief that the natural world is populated by intelligent spirits, and that these inhabit or indwell physical objects like plants and rocks and trees and animals and fish, etc. The question of whether and in what way the world we inhabit might be conscious in some way is then a question that philosophy, physics, and the so-called major religions and the spiritual heritages of animism, and also polytheism will probably come into the conversation as well, have all wrestled with, developed theories about, differ over, and at some points come to similar conclusions about. Whether they differ or agree, they're all trying to explain the world we live in and account for our experiences of it and understand what it all means. They are all, as it were, gathered around the same basic reality, trying to describe it from their respective experiences and assumptions. Now, in coming episodes, I'm going to explore more fully how those three fields of knowledge and experience might speak to the questions of consciousness and the self. As part of transitioning towards that next stage of exploration, I'm going to conclude this episode with two creative offerings, a song and a poem. I've included them in prior episodes, but they seem very fitting here. I'll first present the song called Shimmer. It's actually available to stream. Any streaming device or app should help you get there if you want to hear it again. Just search for Kevin Caldwell and Shimmer. Here's the song.
There's auras in the attics. There's spirits in the dawn. There's something living out in the black holes. The tongues of angels are singing in our songs. And there's a glowing inside the dry leaves, a steady breathing underground. And there's laughter in the stones of mountains. Eyes of light and fire watch all around us. Shiver with a longing, shaking with a hunger. I shimmer in the silence of the living, flaming temple carved deep inside me. Beyond the shapes of cats in my windowsill, the barren lands, tombstone hills, I see a crimson new day dawn, sent here to find me. I've been fired in a furnace, tempered by cold and burn. I've been hammered out on an anvil, my leathered skin the map of every road I've traveled. I'm stacks of stones in quarries mined, some treasured, others left behind, time grinding all our treasures down to gravel. There's auras in the attics and there's spirits in the dawn. There's something living out in the black holes, tongues of angels singing in our song. There's a glowing inside the dry leaves, steady breathing underground, laughter in the stones of mountains, and eyes of light and fire watch all around us. Sunlight in the shadows and moonbeams in the dawn. I see morning's giddy madness, all dressed in flame and dancing in wild abandon. I grab my hat and join the line, move my heavy feet to keep the time with the rhythm inside us all, down in deep canyons. There's auras in the attics and spirits in the dawn. Something's living out in the black holes, tongues of angels singing in our songs. There's a glowing inside the dry leaves, steady breathing underground, laughter in the stones of mountains, and eyes of light and fire watch all around us. They watch us shimmer, we are shimmering. We shimmer with all that's shimmering, and all is shimmering, and we are shimmering. We shimmer with all that shimmers, all is shimmering, and we shimmer with all that shimmers. We shimmer, we shimmer.
Well, if everything shimmers, what is it that shimmers through it all, through us? Is it the subatomic activity of physics, some sort of energy? Is it conscious? The multiple spirits of animism? Is it the divine? Those are all questions that we will turn to. Now for the poem. It was written as a way to try to express artistically how quantum physics describes the cosmos, at least some versions of quantum theory, and I called it Rippling Skies.
I turn my eyes, the sky ripples, canopy of lights glowing, red, growing, slowing, dying, already dead, seeds in the cinders of stars, worlds of worlds in an ember, every pregnant ash, a fullness of empty vastness, a point of ripening intensity, density of verdant heat, explosive power. Every burst births a cycle, expanding, despanding, unspanding, respanding, expanding again, universes begetting universes. Beside, within, before, after are the words that we agree to use, as if we know. Words are flotsam, floating atop inscrutable, unfathomable seas, teeming with creatures frolicking with gleeful disregard for the laws of our pragmatic, reassuring, necessary grammar. But really? Every world is a where with no there, and a there with no where, in a when with no then, a then with no when. We live as we live because we must live as if we live in place and time with these people and plants and pets and problems, as if all of this in fact works the way it seems to work, the way we need it to work, need to believe it works in order to set foot outside a door on a winter morning, or to see and name in wonder a setting sun. Because this is the only way I can live, as this I who lives this way. But really? I carry in myself and am myself carried by. Universes begetting universes. Expanding, despanding, unspanding, respanding, expanding again. Every burst birthing in a cycle, a density of verdant heat, explosive power, a point of ripening intensity, a fullness of empty vastness, every pregnant ash, worlds of worlds in an ember, seeds in the cinders of stars, already dead, slowing, dying, red, growing, a canopy of lights glowing in the rippling sky. I turn my eyes.
Well, whether we live in a cosmos that is conscious or not, the world and everything in it is mysterious, and so are we. In the next episodes, I'll come back to philosophy and physics and religion and to the dimensions of consciousness that I have laid out. To be honest, though, I'm really not sure how I'm going to do that yet. Between now and then, I assume the steps to explore these mysteries will get clearer, though the mystery itself will probably just get more mysterious if my prior episodes are any indication. Until next time.